When comparing games to other mediums, it's clear that while technically being multimedia, incorporating elements such as visual art, music, film, and literature into a whole, the one standout aspect is the interactive element. Philosophical ponderings on the boundaries for what should or should not be considered a game usually boils it down to this: some form of digital interactiveness that's more dynamic than a static linear film, but with enough structural direction to not just become a software application like Photoshop. Even though this too gets kind of fuzzy. Interactiveness is a funny thing. By definition, it's a two-way communication of information between a computer application and its user. So when you press start, the game responds to the request and begins. Then you move Mario left and right and so forth, while the game contextualizes these inputs on the screen. It's easy to get lost in the direct feedback and let the game consume your perception, to almost become a passive observer of the game content. This dynamic exchange between game and player is often understated, and that's a shame. There's a very valuable strength for the player to recognize their voice in these narratives, to understand their ultimate control, and how some games will explore and contextualize this very relationship. Defining the self in games is highly dependent on both genre and overall presentation. Generally, the rift between the player and their avatar seems to occur when the latter is given clear definition in the world, or a distinct characterization. Games with open formats and creative options that encourages free expression will be more effective in making the player's role and agency felt. It's how Mario is a more distinct character than the ambiguous Animal Crossing villager, who will look however the player desires, possibly even taking on the shape as a little caricature of them. Likewise, games with competitive elements, or that otherwise places every individual in a context where they interact with each other, will boost the player's sense of self. Whether it be acting as your own independent agent in a virtual social context, teamwork to help friends and strangers alike, or just in striving to be the winner in a competition. These environments create an obvious reason for players to extend themselves into the game world. Once a particularly hard task is completed, we are quick to say, "I did that, it was me." After all, the ego will take any chance it can get to indulge itself. And if nothing else, hard abstraction of the player avatar will probably cause this too. If there is nothing concrete or figurative to connect yourself personally to, the bond between the player and the game will remain. For example, it's hard to identify the falling blocks in Tetris as separate characters, so the moving of them will always be seen as your actions rather than someone else's. In lots of cases, player agency is widely acknowledged and understood. You participate and interact with the game on your terms and decide what to do. So what's the issue? Well, it seems games with stronger narrative focus or that are otherwise fairly linear don't really connect with some players on this level. This usually makes sense when games are structured enough that individual playthroughs will look roughly the same. It's harder to justify them as being unique in a meaningful way. Everyone can discuss The Secret of Monkey Island on equal terms, because everyone playing it will see and experience roughly the same things. It's the same story being told to everyone. Now, on an individual level, we might struggle with different puzzles or discover different little dialogue bits, but as a whole, it's more or less the same. As such, Guybrush is a distinct character in direct contrast with the player. partly because of his portrayed personality, but more so because there's little room for the player to actually express themselves in Guybrush, when every scenario only has one set outcome. It seems clear that some games are more meant to portray stories with limited interactivity, and that's fine. Some games will just present every player with the same scenario and the same outcomes, and the following discourse around it will be based in the fact that every playthrough was the same. The rift comes when narrative meets interactivity, when the story is decently structured, but will split and diverge into vastly different outcomes based on player interaction. And here, something curious happens. Some people will take the split between alternative A and B and figuratively squash them together as one again. The point of an active choice, the very essence of player agency, has been abandoned and lost on the player. What is canon? What is the lore? What's the right choice? What is the true ending? For a textbook example, let's look at the Stanley Parable, a game that very much acts as a thought experiment on the conflict between linear narratives and player agency. The premise is simple. The player avatar Stanley is accompanied by a narrator voice who cheekily explains what Stanley is going to do. Until a choice appears.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
The voice says what Stanley will do, but the player is the one in control. So this one room with the choice of taking the left or right door while the game is telling you to take the left one is the Stanley Parable in a nutshell. From here, the paths will further diverge and lead to vastly different outcomes that continue to play around with game narratives. It's absolutely the kind of game that you could neatly map out on a flowchart and use that to just watch someone else online show every playthrough and seemingly get the same experience. But truly, isn't the very point of the Stanley Parable to ultimately place the player in this one A or B scenario and have them choose for themselves? The question is always, what would you choose? What is your outcome? Ponder for a second about the Stanley Parable with the rules slightly altered. You go into the game blind and get one single playthrough. Now, the game is recontextualized from a simple exploration of divergent paths into what could possibly be some kind of personality test. Suddenly, your experience is unique. So let's look back. If you ever played the Stanley Parable, can you remember the ending you got first? If so, just consider that this was perhaps your one unique experience with the game. The path guided by your gut reactions. It was the one playthrough where you as a player acted completely independent. It wasn't Stanley driving the story. It wasn't to see a particular outcome. It was you responding to a dilemma with your own reasoning. It was yours. Of course, while exposing the inner workings of the Stanley Parable will take away some of the magic and frame it as something slightly different, the overall message wasn't lost on the players. Because the concept was so simple and straight to the point, honestly on the nose, most people walked away from the game understanding what it had to say and how it explored the presented ideas. Ultimately, it was a successful commentary on player agency in game narratives and paved the way for future games to further explore this subject with determination. On a structural level, Undertale is really not that different from the Stanley Parable. In very much the same way, it diverges at each option. However, this time with a basis in morality. What is different is that Undertale is very much an intricate story with lots of lore and, most importantly, diegetic contextualization of the player and their actions. The whole Undertale package is so rich that it's obviously no wonder people took to it on a level more than just being a game.
No way! No way!
You see, A huge point of the presented morality system, where no one has to die, but basically anyone can, with huge ramifications, is that the game will then proceed to extensively humanize every creature in the underworld. Undertale develops its cast as your friends, who you slowly come to like and feel empathy for. It's no wonder that extensive strive to make the player relate to these characters result in a strong emotional bond, and loads of merchandise. Now, in the rush of appreciating the world of Undertale and its inhabitants, especially among fans who all play the same game, something happened. In mapping out Undertale, its inner workings were exposed and laid bare. The strive for piecing together all the lore into one true canonical context somehow obscured the whole point of Undertale as a game. So let's take a step back and look at what Undertale is about and how this could only be conveyed through its native medium. With great inspiration from earlier games that twisted the role-playing genre on its head, like Earthbound and Yuminiki, Undertale is very much a postmodern deconstruction of these games and the relationship players have formed with them. Through the years, we as players have been conditioned to view stat-based combat mechanics as the core of the role-playing game. Your exploration of the world and participation in its story is constantly interrupted by encounters with enemies, which you defeat to grow stronger so you can take on even mightier foes. Undertale uses this dynamic between player and their opposition by contextualizing any creature you face in battle as a living creature with their own feelings and desires. It then gives you the active choice of either killing or sparing them. This setup of having every encounter be a test of your morality results in the game's narrative diverging in constant little splits towards their individual ends. And while the ultimate outcome won't vary that much between the extremes of killing none or killing all, slight alterations of the game will still be present based on your actions. Undertale is a game that initially presents itself as your average RPG before subverting its foundational tropes and revealing its basis around morality. It seems fairly clear that it expects the player to be somewhat conditioned toward violence before sending its message of non-violence. You're nudged towards being nice and not killing anyone, with any eventual stained conscience presumably being because of initial ignorance. You'll expect it to be the kind of game where you screw up on your first run, and then come clean the second time and achieve that fabled true ending. But Undertale knows this. Prime example, Toriel acts as the first boss of the game after having been a loving mother figure to you throughout the entire opening. You probably don't want to fight her, but as the act command seemingly does nothing, you resort to fighting and end up gruesomely murdering her. This feels wrong and will either leave a sour taste in the player's mouth through the rest of the game, or alternatively prompt the player to reload their save file and try again. The genius of Undertale is that it knows this. It knows it's a game, and it knows that you will try to exploit it. It even allows you to go back and unmurder Toriel, but not before telling you this, that no matter what your current save file states, you still did the deed. You, the player, still did what you did.
I know what you did. You murdered her, and then you went back because you regretted it. Ha 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 ha! You naive idiot!
And as such, Undertale knows that you, the player, have your own agency, not really playing the game as much as you're playing with it. This is where Undertale presents an interesting philosophical question on interactive media. Are you expected to play around with it until you see every outcome, no matter how twisted this practice is? Is all content part of the intended experience? Is the mere implication that you could do something a rationalization that you should? Because as Undertale speaks of kindness and preaches pacifism, it always allows you the opposite. There will always be an option for you to reject its message and go your own path. The so-called genocide route is perhaps where Undertale's theme of player agency versus game narrative is at its strongest. It's the black pit of being evil for the sake of being evil, because you can, and you as a player want to explore that outcome, because you couldn't get enough, you gluttonous beast! In the genocide run, you actively kill every creature in the game, because the question of morality made you want to try and do that for the hell of it. Playing the genocide route is easily the most distinctly different run of Undertale you'll get. It's the one point where the game stops playing around and actively opposes you, removing most character interactions and problem solving for straight grinding and leveling. The genocide path is first and foremost tedious and repetitive. Secondly, since this is most likely not your first run, your relation to the characters will already have formed. It will more or less feel like killing your friends, which is a pretty discouraging act. Lastly, the genocide route is hard. You could say it's a challenge, a cleverly disguised hard mode, but considering the framing, we'd argue that this is not really the case. This seems more like the game actively trying to stop you. It's making the game explicitly not fun and begging you to not continue. Because why should you? No, really, why?
But that's ridiculous, right? Yeah, you're the type of person who won't ever be happy. You'll keep consuming timelines over and over until, well, hey, take it from me, kid. Someday, you gotta learn when to quit.
The genocide route is quite brilliant in that it's the version of Undertale where you actively start abusing the game and it responds by trying to reason with you, to use that player agency of yours and seize the madness. The game just straight up pleads for you to stop playing it because at this point you've become a mass murderer. And this is a really interesting form of control we have over games that is never really explored that much. Our option to stop, to just not play. Because in any game at all, who is the most important character? Well, it's you. Of course it's you. You are the only one making things happen. You are the driving force that controls the universe. When you stop playing, the world stops. The story ends. Yes, there may be content on the disc, but you are not participating in it. If the player stubbornly ignores all this, Undertale will respond with judgment.
My human soul, my determination, they were not mine, but yours.
There is this legacy character in Undertale, only referred to by the graphics file as Kara, who also incidentally shares their name in-game with whatever you choose at the start. The in-universe backstory is not really that important. Kara was basically an edgy kid who became a possessive entity. This has muddied the waters a bit for basic readings of the text, where Kara is perceived to be an independent character in the story. However, it's really obvious for the naming and proper introduction that Kara is meant to be you. It's the name you brandish your save file with and use to represent your individuality. The one confrontation you as a player have with Kara is when you have literally killed everyone and ended the world. So the only one left to confront is yourself. This is when the game manifests your name, your identity, into a being who takes away your control and just ends the game for you. There is no reward at the end of the road, no true ending, only punishment. The only way to get back is by selling your soul, which permanently marks your game with eternal sin. From here on out, anytime you complete the pacifist run of Undertale, the game will taunt you by warping Kara into the otherwise happy ending. People like to read this as some sort of curse, where the ghost of Kara possesses the playable character Frisk and makes them go and do edgy knife stuff. But that's kind of missing the point. Contextualizing Kara as a separate entity from yourself that somehow took control of the game character and made him do evil deeds is a bit disingenuous. It's trying to rid yourself of guilt and blaming someone else. It's ignoring your own agency and seeing the sprawling possibility landscape of Undertale as a flat narrative. This, right here, is probably why the Undertale lore community has never come up with any satisfying answers to questions like why Kara is so atrociously evil. Because they approach the text from an angle that neglects the possibility to rephrase it as, why are you so atrociously evil? Because really, the concept of an entity bearing the player name, possessing the player avatar to do evil stuff is so blatantly on the nose that you need to do some intense eyesight contortionism to not see what the game is telling you. To be blunt, this obsessive reading of Undertale, where everything is a closed system that the player is passively observing, rids the game of its message and meaning. It's curious how Undertale is a very popular game to watch Let's Plays of, because you'd think this stems from knowing what's to come and anticipating the reaction.
Whoa!
But a lot of people actually experienced Undertale this way, vicariously tagging along for the ride, and of course, there's nothing wrong with this. The very nature of Undertale ultimately having fairly binary outcomes makes it easy to argue that you can just watch the game be played by someone else.
It all started because I was curious. Curious what would happen if I killed them. I don't like this, I told myself. I'm just doing this because I have to know what happens.
What an excuse.
You of all people must know how liberating it is to act this way.
At least we're better than those sickos that just stand around and watch it happen. Those pathetic people that want to see it but are too weak to do it themselves.
I bet someone like that's watching right now, aren't they?
Self-aware as Undertale is, it anticipates the Let's Play audience, and in doing so, reinforces the player's role in their own actions. So while you could watch someone else going through Undertale, isn't truly playing it for yourself the more meaningful experience. There's a reason why everyone at release said, you have to play Undertale, but don't look up anything about it. It's a one-in-a-lifetime thing. Walking into Undertale blind is hands down one of the greatest game experiences we've ever had, just because of the extent to which this game not only played with expectations, but also allowed us to express our own agency through it in a way that did not include the knowledge of how the outcomes are structured and work. Undertale is a massive contender for Game of the Decade. Hell, it probably is the Game of the Decade, considering how it's a perfect blend of inventiveness, influence, quality, and success. As the game outgrew itself and took on a life of its own, it was inevitable that the core game aspect of Undertale would get lost somewhere along the way. Nowadays, Undertale is more like a package, a franchise that people engage with on other levels than just being a game. That this audience then start reading and applying the narrative in a non-game context may feel strange, but not unexpected. There is no way we're going to change the general perspective of this being meant to be seen as this.
It's time to stop!
Rather than this. We can try, however. Like, try. Really, really try. We are fairly sure that the vast Undertale lore community will not agree to this. But all we can say to that is...
Get dunked on!
While games like The Stanley Parable, Undertale, and of course, Shadow the Hedgehog highlights the contrast of player agency against the written narrative through active choice, with sprawling diverging paths. This is not necessarily the only way of using this theme. In fact, a more linear structure with rigid scripted outcomes can convey this message equally, or paradoxically, maybe even more strongly. Perhaps by highlighting the player as a sort of de facto god over the little tale being told within the game, with fourth wall breaks and what have you, to make the bond clear. A theater cast is aware of its audience, what prohibits a virtual play to do the same. It's all in the philosophy that you are in control regardless of whether your choices matter or not. Like a train going along its track, it can't turn, but it can always speed up or pull the brake. The perspective of the genocide run of Undertale as a sort of imminent train crash that you can seize anytime you like provides a pretty interesting key for reading other games in a new light. Any senseless violent crusade or modern equivalent of a Greek tragedy may work well for this little mind exercise, but we chose Shadow of the Colossus because the general structure suggests to us that this might actually have been an intentional way of relating to its narrative all along. While being set in a vast open world, Shadow of the Colossus is very linear in its succession. Your task is to track down and defeat giant creatures, which can only be done in a set order and provides no alternative other than killing them. Every single one of the excessive 16 Colossi encounters ends the same way, with the main character Wander being pierced by dark energy and accompanied with another ominous shadow creature in the following segment. He gets increasingly more worn out and lifeless in his futile task of sacrificing all these creatures for the resurrection of one human. The straight reading of this story is that it was morally questionable from the start, and that the recurring motifs of every Colossus encounter gets obvious to the point of their redundancy in that this path will lead to nothing but suffering. You can make a safe assumption on where things will head when Dormin tells Wander at the beginning that he will have to pay a steep price. It shouldn't come off as much of a twist at the end when things predictably spiral out of control. As this was a very unconventional game narrative back in 2005, and that is presented within a cultural landscape that still places little expectation in game audiences to engage with media for subtext, the very blatant portrayal of Wander's morality can fairly be seen as a way to make sure this isn't lost on anyone. If the intention was for pretty much every player to realize that Wander is wrong before the final Colossus is slain, we may come to a pretty interesting conclusion as for what the player is intended to do about it. What if you were just to do as in the genocide run of Undertale? What if you were to just stop playing the game? Of course, with the way we have been conditioned to engage with games, especially by the expectations that were in place in 2005, this reading may appear a bit arcane in its contemporary context. It's very possible that this view of Shadow of the Colossus is only really possible in a post-Undertale context, but it's interesting nonetheless. That the hidden happy ending was always a wargame-style approach. The philosophy that the player is the most important actor in any game narrative wasn't really explored that much in depth before Undertale. Of course, the concept predates that game. Earthbound is a clear predecessor to this idea, with the scene where the player ends up being the final hope for the heroes. However, it's fair to say that since the Undertale implementation is so relatively new, we've yet to see the final evolution of this theme. Because in a post-Undertale environment, there's bound to come a game that either drives these ideas to their logical peak, or act as an ideological opposite to that message. A game that uses Undertale as a stepping stone for the point it's trying to make, a sort of anti-Undertale, you might say. Well, turns out that that game already exists, and it's called Deltarune. Deltarune is essentially a free demo for an even bigger game that is set to be released at some unspecified point in the future. As such, the end product may take things in an entirely different direction than what we anticipate at the moment, but that will be a matter for another time. You know, it makes perfect sense in hindsight. When Undertale turned out to be the massive success it was, people quickly assumed that some sort of sequel would soon surface. But how do you follow up Undertale? It's way too meta for the story to continue, or for the world to be explored further in any meaningful way, since the original is very much a recurring system that you mess around in for different outcomes. There can be no canonical continuity to Undertale, except for the one constant in every playthrough, which of course is the audience. When you open Deltarune, it flat out says that it expects you to have played Undertale before. It's absolutely vital context for this game. The very idea of Deltarune is that it's not Undertale. It expects you to be familiar with the previous game, and that this will inform how you play Deltarune. More or less, Undertale is a game that plays with your expectation of games, while Deltarune is a game that plays with your expectations of Undertale. The method in which it does this is so simple it might even come across as a sort of lazy excuse to make something that's easier to program. But the bookends to the game in particular reinforces that this is 100% intentional. Basically, since Undertale is a game where player agency is used for active choices that dictate the narrative, it's a game where you are always in control, and as such, expect to always be. In contrast, Deltarune is a strictly linear game, which actively taunts you that your choices are absolutely meaningless. Playing Deltarune without the Undertale context will probably make it seem structurally like your normal everyday RPG. The game even takes on a super classic visual fantasy theme of playing cards and chess pieces to further this connection with old tradition. Going back to this old format after Undertale is meant to feel as jarring and limiting as it is portrayed. The opening sequence is a standard fare character creator, with weird choices like the same legs again and again, or pain being a flavor. It even traps you if you end up naming your character after yourself, as the next question is what the name of the creator is. Because the game knows. It knows how you're playing games. It knows what you're expecting. But this also shows that it sees you, the player, as absolutely vital. Deltarune then promptly throws your character out the window with the brilliant justification that, of course, no one can actually choose who they are in this world. From here, you're forced through a world you're not allowed to explore before being bullied by best girl Susie, who gives you an active choice that she straight up interrupts. Because you're not in control. Since when were you the one in control? After falling down the rabbit hole into a fantasy world and being introduced to Questgiver and all-around fluffy boy Ralsei, your party is complete to start your new Undertale adventure. But Susie won't have any of that. She's not going to let you have it that way, so she straight up neglects you and ditches the quest. Susie is equally the most complex and colorful character of Deltarune, as much as she is the glue that connects the theme of control with the game. She will mock the player avatar for being slow and cumbersome. She hates puzzles, actively sabotages your battles, and even ends up joining the bad guys because it's easier. You may play as the silent Chris, or be more consistently accompanied by the orderly and informative Ralsei, but the true main character and protagonist of Deltarune is Susie. Her arc is about evolving from an outwardly aggressive outcast into someone who learns to work with others for a meaningful cause and take responsibility. Like in what other game is your companion so chaotic that you have to warn the enemies of her and cast sleeping spells on your own party? Susie's great, easily better than Ralsei. Yeah, we said it. What about it? Do you want to fight me IRL, bro? The new party setup of Deltarune is basically forcing the pacifist and genocide archetypes into your play session, whether you like it or not. It's true that you can decide if Chris should be a pacifist or not, but it turns out in the end that this has very little effect on the narrative. You will get a different conclusion to the final boss fight, but it's not that important. Again, your choices don't matter. You will have no meaningful impact on the outcomes in the greater picture. Deltarune concludes with the player being awarded the opportunity to explore the small town seen in the opening, which is populated by familiar Undertale characters, but under a different context. Like actors portraying a different role, their new incarnations know nothing about Undertale. The game even allows you to straight up ask them questions about this, which only confuses them. It's fairly clear that this world is meant to represent Undertale within the confines of Deltarune, as the interface is identical and the graphical design less concise and focused. Also, the character portraits are in two-tone, while the ones in the underworld have color. The contrast of going back here after your adventure to a peaceful and unremarkable small town reinforces the idea of Undertale as the old, which has now been made less exciting by the new. If you made it to the end of the game, not really being that interested by the overworld town, it probably means that Deltarune was successful in conditioning you into abandoning Undertale. In a larger scope, the linear structure which forced you to cope with ideologically mixed characters very much poses as a critique on the uncompromisingly black and white morality of Undertale. Susie may be violent, but she is never considered outrightly evil, as much as he may be a feared and misunderstood outcast. She ultimately comes to terms with herself when she befriends the mischievous Lancer, someone she shares a lot in common with. So in order to escape the underworld, the Fun Gang must overthrow the Tyrant King, who incidentally happens to be Lancer's father. Suddenly, Susie is in a conflict where she absolutely wants to get the head of the king, while Lancer begs her not to hurt him. This is the moment where Susie learns to act like a pacifist, in hopes of resolving the conflict without violence. In fact, she's the most eager to talk to the king about a non-violent solution, which makes it even more crushing when the king is the most convicted opponent they've ever faced. The one time she really wanted it, reality hit her in the face, and she's simply forced to be violent for her goals. It's Deltarune's retortion to Undertale's notion of ultimate tolerance. As Karl Popper said, for an open society to remain, we cannot tolerate the intolerant. Sometimes, life is morally grey, and you have no other choice than to speak with your fists. How powerful would this message really have been if all along there actually was an alternative way for you to resolve this conflict? Of course, it's the most mundane thing ever for a video game boss to only be passed by attacking it until you win, but this context of always having had a choice of peaceful resolution up until this point makes this fight feel extremely limiting. Undertale did this too at some points, but never to this extent, where it ultimately portrayed a flaw in the overall moral philosophy. Asgore and Flowey can be spared, and Undertale would encourage this. Deltarune, on the other hand, really gives no choice with the Tyrant King, and it's only through an external de-escalation that the conflict ends. It truly is a moment where the protagonists are pushed into a corner, where they not only have to fight, but are practically motivated to do so, instead of finding an alternative solution. Deltarune finds many ways of addressing the conflict in player agency with game narrative, some ways more direct than others, but perhaps the most brilliant aspect is in the relationship between the player and the player avatar, Chris. Following the aborted character creation at the introduction, we are thrust into the life of Chris, effectively taking control of their life. With the context of player name possessing Frisk in Undertale, it's safe to assume Deltarune takes much of the same approach. However, this time, the relationship seems a bit more malign. Because of the linear scripted structure, where we aren't allowed control in shaping the narrative, Chris already has a solid place within the game world. It feels a lot less like the blank slate of Frisk. It's like we're taking over Chris's life, which is perfectly portrayed at the first save point, where you're actually overwriting Chris's save file with your own. You're making a claim of their life. Chris never says a word and is presented as ambiguous with their intent, to give the impression of a silent protagonist who the player can project upon, but this restriction of not really being able to define their character makes the connection with the player less pronounced. Like there is actually an active conflict over control, because it could be read that while you as a player feel your agency compromised by the lack of choice, Chris might feel even more compromised by the literal entity controlling their body. It's a kind of philosophical conundrum that's interesting in theory but never really implemented in practice, until Deltarune actually straight up confirms this with a brilliant ending. The player avatar Chris gets up in the middle of the night and rips their heart out. The heart, as explained in Undertale, is the core essence of your being, within action sequences, the representation of the player themselves. It's explained that humans are the only ones with these hearts, and for both games, only one human is actively present in the concurrent story. Having determination practically means control over the game world. This is why only the player avatar is allowed this MacGuffin, because it means that an actual human being is controlling them. So Chris takes this absolute representation of the player's influence within the game world and throws it straight into a cage. You can even control the heart while it's trapped within it, confirming that this is what your agency has been reduced to. Chris then goes on to raise a knife and grin an evil grin. At the moment, this mostly feels like a cliffhanger hook for the rest of the game, so there is not really anything substantial to make of this, other than the idea that perhaps Chris has a very set idea of what they want to do with their life that you denied them for your control, no matter how limited it ultimately was. As a bookend to this game that is thematically about the conflict of control within game narratives, with the angle that you, the player, has no choice, it's c'est magnifique. On the whole, Deltarune is a game that takes your expectations from Undertale about freedom of choice and violently forces you into one strict path. And then, at the end of that path, the game yanks that control away from you again and says, guess what, kid? You're just a pawn to this narrative. Susie wants to kill everyone for you, and now Chris is gonna do edgy knife shit on their own, and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, pacifist, you are no one. It's unnerving and humiliating. Deltarune's linear narrative manages, just through the context of its predecessor's open narrative, to perhaps even say more about player agency than Undertale ever could on its own. It's a high-concept experiment of themes in an external meta-game context. It's too specific to exist in a vacuum, a story that can only be told as a sequel in the best possible way, as in the game you play after Undertale, and no concrete lore connection that places it after Undertale in some kind of Zelda-esque timeline, of course. Undertale and Deltarune form a super interesting yin and yang that is entirely connected via the relationship to the player. Together, one reinforces the other tenfold, and this is only because the bond is through not just the nature of games, but how we as people ultimately relate to them. It's an intimately personal duality that speaks its deepest message through your experiences. Knowing what Undertale and Deltarune does is one thing. They are evidently games you can talk about for hours on end, but the only way to truly take their ideas to heart, in the end, is by feeling it. Perhaps the most valuable lesson in these games were not necessarily their commentary on morality in games, but rather how we as players interact with them. While they may be the most prime example of game narratives that highlight the role of the audience, and as such differ a bit from the norm, they are absolutely valuable in spreading this philosophical viewpoint onto the rest of the medium. If you truly take what Undertale and Deltarune had to say about the role of the player to heart, can you really view any game in the same light again? At what point do we righteously detach ourselves from a narrative when we are permanently alerted to our own vital role in it? In the end, the choice is yours to make on how you decide to relate to the games you play, but we would argue that from here on out, that neglectance would be a conscious decision on your part. It's easier to engage with unpleasant actions if we attribute them to someone else other than ourselves. But no matter how evil your game avatar may be, aren't you the one pulling the strings? But that is just some food for thought.
Greetings and welcome to ye end credits, impudent worms. It is I, Rules Card, Duke of Puzzles. We wishes to bring forth gratitude thanks to our most loyal Patreonets, Tommy Håkansson, Sweet Pinketh, Joel Nilsson, an anonymous admirer, Andrew Jones, K. Axwell, Baba Kenzie, Orin Rain, Andreas, Nichtschwert, Athayet, Huang Wu, Nocturno, Emily Smith, Morgan, Casey Explosionet, Biopanda, Flimflam Bourgeois, Yantu. If thou wishest to becomest an admirer, thou can do so throughest Patreon, so that we may display thou on this plaque of grateful underlings. Thine task will be to amass us funds, worms, an army of funds, so we may produce additional visual displays upon YouTube and sustain ourselves with delicious bread and fermented grape beverages. A special thanks brought forward to our compatriots who provided us with additional vocal performances. Be grateful, worms, in thine presence of such fine companions. Curio, Quinton revieweth, and Kiki, whom's may thou beest? Like it, share it, comment, and subscribe it.